Well, when it comes to the victims of communism, the big number in the past, of course, is 100 million, at least 100 million children, men, and women. The number's so big that sometimes you just have to stop and take a breath and say, they were all brothers and sisters to somebody. They were all children of someone. They were parents of someone. These are human beings, not just numbers. And the methods of that were universally, communists used things like deportations. They used some sort of gulag or concentration camp system. They used coerced and forced labor. They used torture and intimidation. And of course, outright imperial warfare against their neighbors. All of those things are the things that result in 60 million people dying in China, 20 million people dying at the hands of the Soviet Union or on the borders around the Soviet Union. A country like Cambodia, a quarter of its population killed by a communist regime, the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s. The list goes on, and it's truly tragic.
Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Eric Patterson, the CEO and president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation based in Washington, D.C. Eric, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. It's my honor.
Eric is here for a conference that I'm hosting tomorrow dedicated to the victims of communism. We will also open an exhibit on this topic. For our Croatian viewers, please explain why there's a museum for victims of communism in the United States, considering that luckily the United States never suffered under that terrible ideology.
Well, it's true that at home, the United States never suffered directly from communism. But the fact of the matter is that whether it's we think about the length of the Cold War, we think about the Vietnam War, we think about the Korean War, there are American lives lost fighting communism. And of course, as a country of immigrants, we have people from Hungary and from Croatia and from so many places that fled communism. When we think just about the bigger story, though, in 1993, the U.S. Congress passed a law, and it was signed into law by Bill Clinton, saying that there should be an organization in the United States to remember the 100 million people murdered by communism in the past, and to be an advocate for the liberty of those still held captive by totalitarian regimes today. That's us.
Very good. I visited the museum. It's a wonderful location in downtown Washington. I've been fighting for this initiative for Zagreb, our capital, to have a place where we can remember the victims and also offer a short history course to younger generation who perhaps are not familiar with the methods and the brutal reality of everyday life under communism. You've been involved in education, in the school system in the United States. Could you elaborate on how this is working, whether there's interest in this topic? Maybe for some Americans it seems that something remote and far away. What has been the reaction of people?
Well, when it comes to the museum itself, I see it as a schoolhouse. And so when we have student groups, 8th graders, high schoolers, college students there, it's a very impressive museum. It's a great learning and experiential opportunity. There's videos, there's AI, things of that nature. Or we put a living witness to communism, someone who fled communism in the past or grew up there. And then we have a set of curriculum and teachers training resources. So all of those things are they're well received. What I would say is that American students need to learn about the Cold War. They need to learn about how World War II was started. They need to learn about the Korean War and the Vietnam War. There's a set of mile markers in U.S. history that are very, very important. And so we produce not just teacher training, but the curricular resources, the videos, the lessons, so that students and teachers can learn about all of those things.
So tomorrow I'll be referring to the Black Book of Communism, a very important resource and reference to the crimes. According to the authors, at least 100 million innocent people were killed under various communist regimes. Could you talk a little bit about just the sheer scale of the crimes of communism on a world level? So, in Croatia, we've had a difficult time confronting this past. Right. It's a very unpleasant topic for many. But I think many people aren't aware of just the number of victims who were afflicted by this terrible movement.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the victims of communism, the big number in the past, of course, is 100 million, at least 100 million children, men, and women. The number's so big that sometimes you just have to stop and take a breath and say, they were all brothers and sisters to somebody. They were all children of someone. They were parents of someone. These are human beings, not just numbers. And the methods of that were universally, communists used things like deportations. They used some sort of gulag or concentration camp system. They used coerced and forced labor. They used torture and intimidation. And of course, outright imperial warfare against their neighbors. All of those things are the things that result in 60 million people dying in China, 20 million people dying at the hands of the Soviet Union or on the borders around the Soviet Union. A country like Cambodia, a quarter of its population killed by a communist regime, the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s. The list goes on, and it's truly tragic.
I want to also mention the figure of Josip Broz Tito, the communist dictator who led the partisan forces during World War II and then consolidated power in 1945. There was a phase of brutal killings of anyone who he considered an enemy of the new regime. May of 1945 was a very dark time for Croatia. But my sense is that he and his advocates have succeeded in many ways in defending his role as a communist leader. Could you elaborate a bit about how he is perceived outside of Croatia? For example, in the United States, among academics, what is the mainstream view, would you say, of this brutal dictator?
Yeah, so the facts of the matter, as you were saying, is this is a man who was a very close lieutenant of Stalin in the 1930s, based in the Soviet Union, complicit in many of the crimes of the Soviet Union. And remember, the Soviet Union helped start World War II. And part of the context of our date today, here we are entering the second week of May, is we're starting to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Well, the precipitating act in August of 1939 was the Soviet Union signing that mutual defense treaty, in a sense, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which said the Soviet Union and its Nazi enemies would not go to war against one another. And just a few weeks later, of course, the Nazis attack Poland, but the Soviet Union comes in from the east, gobbles up the Baltics, gobbles up eastern Poland. Tito was right there. He was a senior lieutenant under Stalin during the period in the run-up to this, and then went and built a part of the partisan army in Yugoslavia. During this time, like any of the communist movements there or in the Spanish Civil War, there's the decapitation, in essence, of other leaders within the movement. Yes. Why? To bump them out of the way. And then, of course, there's the terrible types of killings, not battlefield killings, but the burning down of entire villages, the wiping out of men who had surrendered, what we'd consider prisoners of war, nefarious acts, targeting of religious officials, the burning down of houses of worship. I mean, the crimes of that era, including of the communists, including the ones of Tito, are well documented.
So I think we both share the view that it was, you could describe almost a demonic enterprise, and the direction it led many men to behave is really difficult to comprehend. No limits to the abuse of power, really. Let's move a little forward and closer to our present day. I've witnessed, now being outside of the United States, a radicalization of universities, this still this kind of infatuation with communist leaders, Che Guevara, for example, and others who are in a way lionized instead of vilified. It seems that the younger generation, the social media people who they're not reading maybe serious literature, aren't aware of this reality that we're discussing. Could you maybe talk about how important it is today to spread the truth about what happened so it's not repeated again. Here we are in Brussels, a place where many defend censorship. There's also this new political correctness here that's being imposed on the world of politics. Could you comment just how you see things now in the present in the Western world?
Yeah. Well, a few moments ago, you hinted at the fact that the way that Western academics are largely looking at Tito himself is kind of whitewashing the history there, talking about him as some sort of third-way figure that was different than, say, Stalin. And they're doing that with a lot of these truly terrible individuals from the past, whether it's Stalin or Che Guevara, who truly was a psychopath, a murderer, a rapist, a sadistic person. And whitewashing these as sort of freedom fighters, as people caught in the tragedies of their time, and so they had to find a third way to move forward. And so one thing we have to do, to answer your question, is we have to tell an accurate history, and we have to be telling that story in front of our young people and making it very clear to them. This wasn't because just the individual was bad, but it was because the ideology of revolutionary communism is violent, and it's propagandistic, and it's full of lies every time it's imposed on people. And we have to likewise give them the historical evidence.
Yes.
That's why your effort to build a museum in Croatia to tell an accurate history, an accurate accounting of these things is so crucial. And by the way, there is good news. We pretty much almost all agree that the symbols of Nazism are bad. So what we need to do, so when it comes to that totalitarian ideology, we've done a good job. We have to do the same when it comes to communism. We have to make the hammer and sickle as odious as the swastika. We have to make the word communist as odious as the word Nazi. We have to make the face of Stalin and the face of Che Guevara as repulsive as the face of Hitler.
That's very well said. On a final note, here in Brussels, I find it ironic that after the collapse of communism in Europe, many of the former communists were welcomed here in the European Union. After the entry of many countries in 2004, there were newly appointed commissioners who were very much on the communist side in their countries and were actually complicit in violating basic human rights. Right. You could say on the wrong side of history, but were given a free pass by Western elites at the time. And this goes to your point that there's a double standard towards the communists. The same principle is not applied to them. How do you see that today? So we're removed now 30 years later. Right. Croatia still does not have a museum. I will continue fighting to get one. But we have to really change hearts and minds to make people aware that this kind of way of doing politics is unacceptable.
Yeah, I think there's at least two things there. The first one is that this kind of stifling of fundamental human rights, civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to assemble, the right to publicly express yourself, private property is a part of this. That collection of fundamental human rights, they put boundaries on the state.
Yes.
And what we've had is not just a soft censorship, but these so-called hate speech laws and things. They are anti-democratic. And the reason they're anti-democratic is because they force a false conformity by a bureaucratic state. And that is the first step towards losing more and more freedoms.
Yes.
And so helping our young people to understand how valuable their thoughts, their expression, their religious faith, the choices that they make, that protecting those from coercive power of the state and kind of actually quite hard use of power. That's one thing we have to do. The second is that although there was this lustration or this dealing with some of the shining light on some of the things in the past in some cases, many of the countries we're talking about in Eastern Europe had no lustration.
Yes, including Croatia.
Including Croatia. So maybe a step that needs to be taken now that we're somewhat removed is to follow the example of some of the Latin American countries. I'm just being realistic.
Yes.
Are we going to try people? Probably not, even though a lot of these former communists are still around in some of these places. But what we could do is do a never again type of campaign, like has been done in Latin American countries, where they documented the crimes, they documented the suffering that living people today can report on, that they can give a witness of, and they make that a part of the public record and testimony through a museum, through public documents, through the way that they train their kids in school. Perhaps that's a path.
Yes. You know, it matters. Just recently, our elected president at his inauguration invited elderly woman who's over 100 years old, who actually was present at a massacre of Croatian Franciscans in 1945. She was a witness to this war crime and was invited as a guest of honor to the inauguration of Croatia's president. So this was just in February. So these issues are still timely. They're relevant, hasn't gone away. It's part of my agenda to educate the public at large. My voters are expecting this. So I want to finally thank you for making the trip from the United States to speak here at the European Parliament, and extend to you an invitation to visit Croatia on a future occasion where we can continue this conversation.
Well, that would be a pleasure, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I wish you the best, because I think it is part of the health of your country to be able to take some of these additional steps.
Yes. Thank you, Eric. So, dear friends, that's the end of one episode that is, I would say, is a special episode here in Brussels at the European Parliament. We will continue to keep you informed on my work here fighting for Croatia. Croatia first. Thank you.